I'm so excited to talk about this book with you guys. You have no idea. I've been searching for an excuse to review this book since I started this channel. And now I have one because the author, Claudia Gray, is doing the Leia book that's coming out on September 1st. And she wrote my favorite Star Wars book of all time that we're going to be talking about today, Lost Stars. This is legitimately my favorite Star Wars novel, period. Canon or Legends or sourcebook or anything. Lost Stars for me is probably in my top 3 favorite novels of all time, and definitely by far my favorite Star Wars novel. I get to talk about it now. Yay! Fair warning, spoilers. Please, if you haven't read this book, you need to go and experience this book before you watch this video. So, yeah. Now we'll jump into it. So essentially the story of Lost Stars is Thane Kyrell and Ciena Rey are 2 children growing up on Jelocan, a small outer rim planet. And they've grown up in 2 very different households, 2 very different cultures on the same planet. And they end up befriending each other at a very young age. They help each other through the Imperial Academy. And then Thane changes his mind and ends up going into the rebellion, and Ciena sticks through the Empire all the way through Return of the Jedi, and even during she fights during the Battle of Jakku on the Imperial side, and they have to deal with their feelings for each other because they've been together for so long. They ended up falling in love with each other, and it's so well defined in that the characters' motivations make sense to me. So we'll talk a little bit about the story first and how Claudia Gray chose to go about telling it. The entire first half of the book really feels more like a manga, almost. That might be me projecting a little bit just because they did adapt this story into a manga for the Japanese market, which was a perfect call now that I'm retroactively looking at it. It's the entire first half of the book is nothing but Ciena and Thane growing up together, growing closer to one another, pushing each other through any sort of struggles that they're dealing with, egging each other on throughout their days at the academy. And it's really a story that you might expect to see in a Japanese manga or a Japanese anime. And then suddenly the story shifts. I want to say probably about the same time that Thane transitions into being a rebel instead of just being an Imperial deserter. There's a very specific scene where suddenly, without even realizing it, Claudia Gray manages to pull it from being this sort of story about star-crossed lovers into a much more adult version of the same thing, a more Star Wars-y version of the same thing. And that is when Thane is racing away from the Battle of Hoth in his X-Wing, and he's thinking about how Ciena could be on one of those ships. And I don't know what it is about Claudia Gray's writing for me. This goes into Bloodline, which we'll be reviewing in 2 weeks. Claudia Gray's writing just, how do I put this? It turns on the visual part of my brain. I can see that sweeping shot of Thane looking out of his X-Wing cockpit and looking out on this the Imperial Armada, knowing that Ciena is on one of those ships, and there voluntarily because she's an Imperial loyalist, and I can see the camera pulling away as he veers off and then jumps into hyperspace. And suddenly you're thrust back into the Star Wars universe, even though that you never really left it. It probably the best way to explain it is imagine a Clone Wars arc that suddenly, without you even noticing, transitions into something more akin to Empire Strikes Back in its tone and in its delivery of characters and the complexity of the characters. And that's another thing that I love about this book. The characters are amazing. Mostly. If I do have one tiny little critique about this, it's that Ciena's motivation for staying with the Empire is actually Mitchell, one of the subscribers and very frequent commenters on the channel. Hi, Mitch. Put this out when we were doing the Inferno Squad review. And that's that Ciena is an honor above all type of person, whereas Iden Versio is an empire above all type of person. And her motivation for staying with the Empire is that, well, it would be dishonorable to leave her station. She made a vow to the Empire when she graduated from the Academy. She cannot let that go because of cultural background and just personal family background and so on and so forth. Sometimes, though, she does come off a little Zuko Season 1, for anybody that has watched The Last Airbender, which is a phenomenal show. Dave Filoni worked on it, fun fact. It's a fantastic show. Anyways, for anybody that doesn't know, Zuko was a character who kind of... he was a little bit honor, 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 honor. And Ciena gets almost to that point, not quite as obnoxious, but and she comes around and she definitely grows on you. That was just an issue that I had, but Thane's motivations were absolutely perfectly put out. His father was physically and emotionally abusive. His mother was emotionally abusive. His older brother was physically abusive. And so he grew up with a distrust and dislike of authority figures. And being in the Imperial war machine doesn't really make you trust more, make you have more trust in authority figures. And so that's the reason for his desertion. And then he realizes that the Empire needs to be fought. He may not agree with the Rebel Alliance. He may not be as idealistic as most rebels, but he wants to just destroy the Empire, whereas Ciena needs to serve it. And there's so many wonderful scenes. Like when Thane is trying to convince Ciena without actually saying so to get her to leave the Empire with him. He thinks that he convinced her, and she thinks that she convinced him to stay with the Empire, and they're both perfectly content and happy with the conversation until a week later when Ciena gets the news that Thane deserted, and Ciena goes, "Wait, what?" And the writing, like the dialogue in between the two characters, was perfect, especially considering the fact that this conversation doesn't happen until just after the halfway point in the book, if memory serves me correctly. It's so good. Now let's talk about the secondary characters, because we do have Ciena and Thane, which is 90% of our book, and we never deviate from their perspective, but they do interact with a lot of other characters, and there are 3 secondary characters that I absolutely adored in this book. Number 1 would be Nash Windrider. Nash Windrider was Thane's bunkmate, and then later on served on the same ships twice as Ciena after Thane deserted. And Nash Windrider was an Alderaanian. He watched the Death Star blow up his own planet. Now, instead of deserting, he had sort of like a psychotic break. An emotional break, which would make sense. You just watched your home planet get destroyed along with all of your friends and family and everybody that you ever knew and everything that you ever knew. I get it. but he snapped. He almost went insane. He still manages to rationalize why they had to be destroyed. And it's fascinating. Post Alderaan's destruction, Nash Windrider is a fascinating character, and I want a standalone story about this character. The second character that I absolutely loved was Yendor, who is sort of Thane's best friend in the Rebellion. One of his fellow pilots in Corona Squadron, the squadron that Thane flies with. I love Yendor because he reminded me so much. He is a Twi'lek, so he looks like this other character, but he reminds me of Noara Ven from the X-Wing series. Kind of a smart mouth, kind of a bit of a punk, but really friendly and hyper intelligent. And he really reminded me a lot of Noara Ven. And I love Noara Ven because I love the X-Wing novels so much. Those are my second favorite Star Wars novels. And then the third character that I absolutely adored in this book actually dies relatively quickly. Again, spoilers. She dies relatively quickly within this book, and that's Jude. Jude was a native of Bespin. She was Ciena's bunkmate, and she was actually on the Death Star. Jude was actually the technician that noticed the flaw in the Death Star, realizing that the thermal exhaust port was basically a ticking time bomb, or more of the fuse that could be lit to blow up the entire station. And she's the one that then analyzed their attack and then realized it and then sent off that information, which then ended up, which we see in A New Hope, ends up getting to Tarkin, and then we get the ever infamous / famous line of "Evacuate in a moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances." And that leads me to another slight issue that I have with this novel, and an issue that a lot of people did have with this novel upon its release. And that's that there were too many connections. There's too many tiny little connections that lead back to the original trilogy, which for the most part, I'm okay with about 90% of these weird little connections, because this is the story about the original trilogy, but from the normal person's viewpoint. And normally, I'm okay with this. They're really pushing this in the new canon, that sense of Sonder, which basically means that you have an awareness that everyone around you has just as complex of a life as you do. And I find that so important. You know, this person has that much of a backstory, and this person has a backstory too, and that person did a thing, and that person has these feelings at this point in time, and that's incredibly important to flesh out a universe and flesh out a story. If you look at like Game of Thrones, that has a cast of, the books have casts of literally hundreds of different characters, and just the show alone probably has a cast of about 100 primary, secondary, and tertiary characters. That's incredibly important to build out a story, but sometimes it does get a little bit too close. Probably the biggest one that stands out is that Ciena and Nash were the ones that sabotaged the Millennium Falcon on Bespin. They're the ones that broke the hyperdrive. That's a little bit but there are a lot of really good connections too. There are a lot of good little Easter eggs and little tidbits. I can't even list them off, to be honest with you. These connections that are just so good and so eye-opening, I suppose. And finally, my main big complaint about this book is that it suffers from the same fate, to a lesser extent, that Battlefront Twilight Company had, which is it just kind of ends. There is no real closure, really. It ends with Ciena being captured at the Battle of Jakku by Thane, and then she's held as a war criminal, and then the book ends. You have no idea whether or not she was pardoned, whether or not she ended up doing something else, whether or not they ended up getting together. They ended up deciding to, set aside all of the conflicts and stuff that they've had with each other over the years and to, pick up their relationship again. You don't really get a closure with these characters. I'm really, really hopeful for either give me a comic series or something, please. I need to know what happens to Ciena and Thane post Battle of Jakku. Now, with all that being said, again, this is my absolute favorite Star Wars novel. If you have not read it, again, you shouldn't have even watched this video if you hadn't read it. Go do it right now. Like, it is branded as a love story. But it's so much bigger. To paraphrase, or to quote, I should say, Luke Skywalker, but it is so much bigger than just a love story. It's such a good book. That's all I have to say. I'm sorry I can't be more nuanced than that. It's just so flippin' good. But anyways, I think that I'm just going to end this video here because otherwise I'm just going to end up pulling my physical copy off the bookshelf back there and reading out all of my favorite passages, which is the entire book. And I couldn't imagine trying to edit that or the copyright infringement that I would have to deal with. Thank you guys as always for your time. If you've read this book, what did you think about it? Tell me I'm not crazy in absolutely adoring this story that was branded as a young adult romance novel. Let me know what you guys think. I'd love having conversations with you guys down in the comments down below. If you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. It lets me know that I'm doing something right with these videos. And if you're new here, also hit that subscribe button so you can keep up on all the other reviews and other random ramblings that I throw up on this channel. Thank you guys, as always, for your time. And as always, may the Force be with you.